The black SUV moved through downtown Chicago like a ship cutting through still water, sleek, purposeful, and completely indifferent to everything it passed. Tinted windows sealed the interior from the outside world, and inside, Harrison Cole sat with his phone pressed to his ear, his Italian suit immaculate, his jaw set in the permanent expression of a man who had not smiled without intention in years. At 42, Harrison was the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings, whose face graced the covers of financial magazines, and whose decisions moved markets before most people had finished their morning coffee. He was worth $4.3 billion on a slow week, and he never, not once, let anyone forget it. Not through words, but through the calculated weight of his presence. "Cancel the afternoon meeting with the Langford Group," he said into the phone, not bothering with a greeting to the assistant on the other end. "Reschedule to Thursday, and tell them I need the revised projections before they walk in the door this time." He paused, listening. "I don't care what their excuse is, Marcus. If they want my capital, they'll respect my time." He ended the call without a farewell and slipped the phone into his breast pocket, turning his gaze to the window as the car slowed in downtown traffic. Chicago was alive in the way that only large American cities are alive on a Tuesday afternoon, simultaneously exhausted and electric. Street vendors shouted their wares, yellow cabs played their aggressive symphony of horns, and hundreds of people moved along the sidewalks below like a river that never stopped flowing. Harrison watched them with the detached curiosity of a man observing fish in a tank. He had grown so accustomed to observing life from behind glass, literally and figuratively, that he had almost forgotten he was once part of that river himself. "Mr. Cole, there's construction on Michigan Avenue. I'm going to cut through Garfield Boulevard," his driver, a quiet man named Desmond, said from the front. "Fine," Harrison replied, already returning to the emails on his phone. The detour took them through a part of the city that Harrison had not visited in years, not because it was particularly dangerous, but because it was ordinary. The kind of neighborhood where time moved differently, where the buildings were old but not charming, where corner stores and laundromats occupied the spaces that boutiques and coffee shops filled on the north side. Harrison barely glanced up as they turned onto a long stretch of road lined with tall elms that had lost half their leaves to the early October chill. And then Desmond slowed the car. "Sir," he said carefully, "isn't that your mother?" Harrison looked up from his phone with the mild irritation of a man interrupted. His eyes moved to the sidewalk. His irritation dissolved. His breath caught. There, seated on a concrete bench outside a small church, was Margaret Cole, his 71-year-old mother, her silver hair pinned neatly despite everything, leaning her white-haired head against the shoulder of a black woman who appeared to be sleeping rough, a worn blanket across her lap, a small pile of belongings at her feet. Margaret's eyes were closed, her face peaceful. The two women sat together in the gray autumn light as though they had known each other for a lifetime. Harrison Cole, the man who moved markets, who canceled meetings without apology, who had not cried since his father's funeral 18 years ago, froze completely. For 3 full seconds he did not breathe. Then he threw open the car door and rushed across the street. The cold hit him first when he stepped out of the car, that sharp, teeth of autumn cold that Chicago specializes in, the kind that cuts through even the finest wool coat as though it has a personal grievance against warmth. Harrison barely registered it. His eyes were fixed on his mother and the woman beside her, and his long legs carried him across the pavement in quick, determined strides, drawing startled looks from the two people who had been walking calmly past him on the sidewalk. Up close, the scene was both simpler and more complicated than it had appeared from the car window. His mother, Margaret Cole, was not injured. She was not in distress. She was simply resting. Her small, age-softened body leaned gently sideways, her silver head against the shoulder of the woman beside her, her eyes closed in what appeared to be genuine, comfortable sleep. The expression on her face was the most relaxed Harrison had seen in years. A paper cup of coffee, still faintly steaming, sat on the bench beside her gloved hand. The woman Margaret leaned against was perhaps 50, though hardship has a way of making age difficult to read. She was a black woman with close-cropped natural hair dusted at the temples with gray, her brown skin weathered by time outdoors, her clothing layered and practical rather than chosen for appearance. She wore a man's oversized canvas jackets. Over two visible sweaters, dark trousers with a patched knee, and boots that had seen many winters. A tattered, quilted blanket was folded over her lap. A canvas bag, a worn backpack, and a small milk crate packed with folded items sat at her feet with the careful order of someone who had learned to keep their world organized in a very small space. She was awake, and she was watching Harrison approach with eyes that were calm, dark, and entirely unafraid. The eyes of a woman who had long since passed through whatever fear of judgment she had once carried. "She's all right," the woman said quietly before Harrison could speak. Her voice was low and steady, like a river that didn't rush. "She sat down about 20 minutes ago. Said her feet were bothering her. We got to talking, and she dozed off. I didn't want to move and wake her." Harrison stood over them both, breathing harder than a short sprint should have warranted, and stared. His mind, trained by decades of business to assess situations and respond with calibrated precision, was doing something it almost never did. Nothing useful. It was simply cycling through images: his mother's peaceful face, this stranger's quiet patience, the untouched coffee beside his mother's hand, the careful neatness of the woman's small pile of belongings. "You've been sitting still so she could sleep," he said. It came out less as a question and more as a man hearing himself understand something slowly. "It's cold," the woman said simply. "Body heat helps." And she looked like she needed the rest. Harrison crouched down to his mother's level, and the movement woke her. Margaret Cole had always been a light sleeper, even in her most peaceful moments. Her eyes opened slowly, found her son's face, and rather than showing the surprise Harrison expected, she smiled with the serene unhurriedness of someone returning from a very pleasant dream. "Harrison." She patted his cheek with one gloved hand. "You're frowning again." "Stop that." "Mom." His voice came out smaller than he intended. "What are you doing out here? Agnes said you had a doctor's appointment on the north side." "Where is Agnes?" Agnes was his mother's homemaid, a reliable Filipino woman in her 40s who had cared for Margaret for 3 years. Agnes had a family emergency. Her daughter called. "I told her to go." Margaret said this with the regal practicality of a woman who had raised 4 children on a school librarian's salary and considered herself more than capable of navigating the world without supervision. "I took the bus. My hip started aching, and I sat down for a moment. And then I met Diane." She gestured to the woman beside her with the casual warmth of someone introducing a new friend at a dinner party. Harrison looked at the woman, at Diane, and felt the full weight of his earlier manner land on him like something dropped from a great height. "Diane," he said. "That's me," she replied. She had not shifted her posture or changed her expression. She was neither performing humility nor demanding acknowledgement. She simply existed in the moment with a steadiness that Harrison found, in some wordless place inside him, quietly extraordinary. "Thank you," he said, "for sitting with her." Diane looked at him for a moment with those calm, measuring eyes. Then she looked at Margaret, who had taken Harrison's hand in both of hers and was squeezing it with the gentle tyranny that only mothers command. "She's good company," Diane said. "Told me about your father. Sounded like a good man." Harrison Cole, who had not cried since his father's funeral, felt something move behind his eyes like a fish turning in deep water. He blinked it back. But he didn't stand up and walk away. Not this time. Margaret Eleanor Cole, née Patterson, had grown up in the south side of Chicago in the 1950s and 60s, in a 3-bedroom house that held 6 children, 2 parents, a grandmother who smelled of lavender and conviction, and the permanent background music of economic uncertainty. Her father, Walter Patterson, had worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood: days at the plant, evenings as a janitor at the elementary school where his children studied, and her mother, Cora, had stretched every dollar until it thinned like old cloth and then found ways to stretch it further. They had been, by every measurable standard, poor. What they had also been, and this was the thing that Margaret had spent 71 years trying to make her children understand, was decent. Not decent in the passive, uninspiring sense of simply avoiding wrongdoing, but actively, intentionally decent. The kind of decency that noticed when a neighbor's light was off and their refrigerator was empty. The kind that gave without calculation, that shared without keeping score, that treated every human being as someone whose dignity deserved to remain intact regardless of what their bank account said about them. She had tried to raise Harrison with that decency. She had believed, for a long time, that she had succeeded. And then her husband, Robert Cole, had died of a heart attack at 58, leaving behind a small insurance policy, a modest house that was mostly paid off, and 4 children in various stages of their lives. Harrison, the oldest, the one with the business degree and the ferocious ambition, had taken his father's death and transformed the grief into fuel. Within 5 years, the small logistics company he had been building with 2 partners had become a regional powerhouse. Within 10, it was national. Within 15, it was the kind of enterprise that appeared in textbooks. Margaret had been proud. She was still proud. But pride and worry, she had learned, were not mutually exclusive emotions. She had watched her son change in ways that were subtle enough to deny, but impossible to ignore. The way he spoke to service staff, not rudely, never rudely. Harrison was too controlled for rudeness, but with a kind of practiced indifference, as though the person in front of him was a function rather than a human being. The way he had stopped calling his sisters as often. The way his visits home had become briefer and more scheduled, planned with the efficiency of business meetings rather than the loose, warm wandering of a son coming home to be held for a while by his origins. She had tried talking to him about it twice in the past 3 years. Both times, Harrison had listened with a patient, slightly too attentive expression of a man who was hearing her words but not receiving them, the expression of someone waiting politely for a speech to conclude so the meeting could continue. So Margaret Eleanor Cole, who had lived long enough to stop waiting for the right moment, had quietly started engineering moments of her own. Not this one. This one had been genuinely accidental. Her hip truly did ache. Agnes truly had received an emergency call. Margaret truly had sat down because the bench was there, and her body had asked her to. But the thing she felt when she opened her eyes and found her son crouching in front of her, his expensive coat against the cold concrete, his face unguarded for perhaps the first time in years, that feeling was something she had been hoping and praying toward for a very long time. Now, Harrison sat beside her on the bench, the cold bench on the ordinary street, in the part of the city he had driven through without seeing, and Diane sat on her other side, and Margaret held her son's hand the way she had when he was 5 years old and frightened of the dark. "Tell me about your morning," she said to Harrison. It was such a simple question. So disarmingly, ruthlessly simple. Harrison opened his mouth to give the kind of answer he had trained himself to give, a brief, informative summary, and found that the words he had prepared were not the ones that came out. "I canceled a meeting," he said. "The Langford Group. They keep presenting incomplete projections. I've told them twice." He paused. "Marcus thinks I'm being too hard on them. Is Marcus right?" Margaret asked pleasantly. Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Probably," he admitted. Diane made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh, restrained. "What?" Harrison said, looking at her. "Nothing," she said. "Just that the honest answer surprised me. Most people don't admit that so quickly." "I have no reason to pretend around my mother," Harrison said. Then he stopped. He heard what he had just said. He thought about how rarely he extended that same truthfulness anywhere else. Margaret squeezed his hand. On the other side of her, Diane shifted the blanket on her lap and looked out at the street with the patient gaze of a woman who had learned that the world moved on its own schedule and that struggling against it exhausted you unnecessarily. Harrison looked at her and asked, before he fully decided to, "How long have you been out here?" Diane turned to look at him. She did not look defensive or embarrassed. She looked, if anything, like someone deciding whether a question deserved a real answer. "About 14 months, she said. Give or take." Harrison nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry, because something in the steadiness of her manner suggested that pity was not what she needed. He did not look away because he had been looking away from things like this for a long time, and it had cost him something he was only beginning to name. "That's a long time," he said. "It is," Diane agreed. And then, to his own great surprise, Harrison Cole, the man who had once declared in a magazine interview that sentiment was the enemy of good decision-making, did not reach for his phone, did not stand up, did not prepare a solution or an exit. He sat on the cold bench, holding his mother's hand, and listened. Her full name was Diane Loretta Washington, and she had not always slept under overpasses and carried her life in a canvas bag and a backpack. There had been a time, not so long ago, in the grand calendar of a life, though it felt both recent and ancient when she thought about it, when she had slept in a bed with a blue quilt, in a house with a small yard, in a neighborhood that was not wealthy but was warm and known and hers. She had been a licensed practical nurse for 19 years, working the overnight shift at St. Bernard Hospital on the South Side. She had been good at it, genuinely good, not just technically proficient but good in the deeper way that matters in medical care, the way that makes patients feel less afraid when the room is dark and the machines beep with their cold, indifferent regularity. She had a quality that some of her colleagues lacked and could not be taught, the ability to be fully present with a person who is frightened. To sit in the particular kind of silence that is not empty but full of something steady and human. She had a daughter, Kezia, who was 23 now and lived in Atlanta and called on Sundays and birthdays and holidays and some random Tuesdays when the spirit moved her. The calls were good. The calls were the best part of most weeks. Kezia was studying to be a social worker, which made Diane proud in the particular, aching way that parents are proud of children who choose hard and necessary work. The unraveling had not come from one catastrophic event, though people always expected it to. People expected a story like hers to have a villain, a single terrible turning point, a moment dramatic enough to explain everything that followed. But the truth was smaller and more ordinary, and, in its way, more devastating because of that ordinariness. It came from a series of ordinary failures stacked against each other like stones in a wall. First, her mother had fallen ill, a prolonged illness, a year and a half of mounting medical debt that her mother's insurance covered in part but not in full, and Diane had been the one because she was the one who was there, because she was the one who knew how hospitals worked, who had navigated it all and contributed what she could from her salary and then from her savings. Her mother had died anyway, in the spring of a year that had already stripped Diane of too much. Then the hospital had downsized, eliminating the overnight nursing positions they had held as temporary for years, as hospitals do, promising the kind of permanence that they can revoke in a restructuring memo. Diane had found herself without the job she had held for 19 years, with a grieving heart and a depleted savings account and a rental market that had transformed during her years of careful, modest living into something unrecognizable and merciless. She had stayed with her sister for 4 months until that situation became unsustainable. Her sister's husband had his own struggles, and 4 people in a 2-bedroom apartment is not a solution but a delay. She had applied for housing assistance and been placed on a wait list that moved with the speed of a glacier. She had applied for jobs and found that the gap in her employment history, combined with the emotional weight she was visibly carrying, made interviews difficult. She had lived in her car for 6 weeks until the car's transmission failed and the cost of repair exceeded what the car was worth. And then there was the bench, and the blanket, and the careful organization of the small world that fit in a canvas bag and a backpack. She told Harrison most of this, not all of it, not the parts that were still too close to touch without unraveling, in the measured, unsentimental way she told it when she chose to tell it at all. She was not performing tragedy. She was not asking for anything. She was simply answering the question of a man who had, for once, appeared to be genuinely listening. Harrison did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions mid-sentence, which was a habit she had observed in people who were uncomfortable with difficulty and wanted to resolve it quickly so they could feel better. He sat with what she said the way she had once sat with frightened patients in the dark, present and still, and unafraid of the weight of what was true. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet. "You are a nurse," he said, not phrasing it as a question but as someone absorbing something that mattered. "I am a nurse," she said. "Being out of work doesn't change what you are." Harrison looked at her. She watched something shift in his face, something that had been set hard, like a jaw before a difficult conversation, loosening by degrees into something more open, more human. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." That was a poor choice of words. Diane considered him. She was not easily impressed by apologies. She had learned that apologies were easy and change was slow, but there was something in the directness of his correction of himself, the absence of defensiveness, that gave the apology actual weight. "It was," she agreed. "But thank you for fixing it." Margaret, who had been listening to all of this with her eyes half closed and the expression of a woman watching something she had long hoped for slowly begin to happen, made a small sound of quiet satisfaction. Neither of them commented on it, but both of them heard it. The gray October sky shifted above the elm trees. A bus rumbled past. Somewhere down the block, a child was laughing. Harrison pulled out his phone, and Diane braced herself for the moment she had seen many times, the pivot back to the world that mattered, the symbolic drawing of the curtain. But Harrison did not open an email or take a call. He checked the time, put the phone back in his pocket, and turned to his mother. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. Margaret opened one eye very deliberately. "No," she said. "None of us are. Get us some coffee." Desmond, who had been sitting patiently in the black SUV with the resigned professionalism of a man accustomed to his employer's unpredictable pauses, was sent to the coffee shop on the corner, a small, independent place with a hand-painted sign and the warm smell of roasting beans that drifted half a block into the cold air. He returned in 8 minutes with 3 large cups, a paper bag of pastries that nobody had requested but that he had purchased on the working theory that people were always in better moods with something warm to eat, and a stack of extra napkins. Harrison received this quietly and carried the cups to the bench himself, did not hand them off, did not delegate, but walked back across the sidewalk with 3 cups held carefully in both hands, the paper bag looped over his wrist. He distributed them without ceremony. Diane received hers with both hands, as people who are often cold receive warmth, the cup held close, the steam rising to the face, the brief and private expression of relief that she did not hide but also did not perform. The coffee was good, the kind of small, unremarkable pleasure that transforms a moment, that makes the cold feel like a backdrop rather than an adversary, that puts a pause in the particular rhythm of a difficult day and says, "Rest here a moment, this is fine, this is enough." Margaret opened the paper bag, extracted a small croissant, examined it with the satisfaction of a woman whose standards had outlasted her circumstances, and divided it into 3 parts without asking anyone's permission. "Mom," Harrison said. "You haven't eaten since this morning," she said, handing him a third of the croissant as though this were a statement of cosmic law rather than an educated guess. "I can always tell. You get this look." "What look?" he said. "Like someone slowly taking air out of you," she said. Diane laughed, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, and then she looked briefly surprised at herself for it. Harrison looked at her when she laughed, and something in the expression on his face was startled, and then something else, something closer to gratitude, though he would have struggled to articulate why. They sat with their coffee and their divided croissant in the gray October light, and the conversation became something that Harrison could not have planned or manufactured or assembled from strategy. It became real. Not the managed, purposeful kind of real that characterized his professional interactions, where authenticity was deployed as a tool of connection, but genuinely and inconveniently real, the kind that surfaces when the usual machinery of social performance gets stripped away by cold air and unexpected circumstance. Diane spoke about her daughter Kezia in Atlanta, and her voice changed when she did, became warmer, less measured, cracked at 1 or 2 edges with a combination of pride and longing that she clearly did not bother to conceal. "She calls every Sunday," she said. "Like clockwork. She doesn't know the full situation. I've told her I'm in a transition." She said the word transition with a wry, self-aware edge that acknowledged both its inadequacy and its usefulness. "Does she know any of it?" Harrison asked. "She knows enough to worry," Diane said. "I don't want to give her more than that. She's starting her life. I'm not going to make it smaller by putting my problems in the middle of it." She said this without self-pity, as a statement of a philosophy she had thought through and arrived at deliberately. Harrison said nothing for a moment. He was thinking, though not about strategy or solutions, simply thinking, the way that people think when something has caught them against their expectations and opened a small window. "I didn't tell my mother when the company nearly collapsed," he said, surprising himself. "In 2012. We were 9 weeks from insolvency. I had 3 people dependent on my decisions and a market that was moving against us in every direction." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I didn't tell her because I didn't want her to worry, but also because I didn't want her to see me failing." Margaret did not look surprised. She looked as though she had known this for years and was waiting for him to know it too. "Failure isn't seeing," she said. "It's hiding." The elm trees above them moved in a gust of wind, releasing a small shower of leaves that spiraled down around the bench. Diane caught one by instinct, looked at it, yellow, shot through with orange, perfectly ordinary, one of 1,000 that afternoon, and placed it carefully on top of her canvas bag. "I used to collect leaves with Kezia when she was small," she said. "She had a scrapbook. She kept every one." She looked at the leaf on the bag and smiled, the kind of smile that has some sadness in it but is still, fundamentally, a smile. "She might still have it." "She does," Harrison said, and then stopped, because he didn't know that, and the certainty in his voice surprised him. Diane looked at him. "I mean, she sounds like the kind of person who would," he said. Diane considered him for a moment. "She is," she agreed. The afternoon light was thinning. The street had grown a little quieter in the pre-evening lull. Desmond was still in the car, reading something on his phone with the patience of a man who had learned that his employer's timelines were, on occasion, fictional. Margaret finished her third of the croissant, folded the paper bag neatly, and looked at both of them with the calm, satisfied gaze of a woman who has been proven right about something she never stopped believing in. "So," she said pleasantly, in the tone she had once used to bring family dinners back on track after they went sideways, "what do we do now?" That night, Harrison sat alone in his 48th floor apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a city that glittered with the cold and indifferent beauty of enormous wealth, and he did not sleep. He sat in the large chair by the window, the chair that had been chosen by an interior designer whose name he could not recall, a chair that cost more than Diane's car had been worth before its transmission failed, in an apartment that cost more per month than a year of careful living would provide for a family of 4, and he looked at the city and tried to organize his thoughts the way he always organized things, systematically, strategically, with clear categories and actionable conclusions. He found that he could not. His mind kept returning to the bench, to his mother's face, peaceful against a stranger's shoulder, to Diane's calm eyes, unafraid and uncollapsed, carrying 14 months of outdoor living with a dignity that he had spent 42 years and $4.3 billion trying to project and had never quite achieved. To the leaf on the canvas bag. To the way the word transition had sounded in her voice, wry and precise and completely honest about its own limitations. He had driven away from the bench having done 2 things. Given Desmond instructions to purchase a proper cold weather package from the outdoor supply store 4 blocks over, sleeping bag, thermal underlayers, quality gloves, a waterproof pack cover, and to deliver it to the bench before dark, along with 3 days' worth of good food from the deli on North Clark. He had done this efficiently, quietly, without announcement, and had felt, as he made the arrangements, the reflexive satisfaction of a man solving a problem. But now, in the apartment, with the city below him and the silence around him, the satisfaction felt thin. Not wrong. The thermal sleeping bag and the food were better than nothing, were in fact significantly better than nothing, and Diane's pragmatic acceptance of them when Desmond delivered them with a note from Harrison had been genuine. But they were a man throwing a coin from a great height and calling it generosity. The truth that was keeping Harrison Cole awake on his 8th floor chair was not a truth about Diane. It was a truth about himself. He had built his fortune, in part, on a philosophy he had developed in his mid-30s and articulated so many times in interviews that it had begun to feel self-evidently true, that the world was organized by capability and effort, that those who succeeded had earned their success, that the primary moral obligation of wealth was to create more wealth, which would then through the reliable machinery of markets and employment, do good at scale. It was a clean philosophy, a defensible philosophy, a philosophy that allowed him to drive through neighborhoods like the one his mother had been sitting in and look at the people on those streets and feel, if not warmth exactly, then a kind of organized compassion. They were the beneficiaries of an ecosystem he was helping to build, even if the connection between his boardroom decisions and their daily lives was too complex and indirect to see. Diane had been a nurse for 19 years. She had sat with people who were dying and made them less afraid. She had been undone not by failure of effort or capability, but by a sequence of ordinary disasters: illness, grief, economic restructuring, the compound math of poverty that could have befallen any person, that had, statistically, befallen many people, that had, if he was being honest with himself, very nearly befallen his mother in the years after his father's death, before Harrison's company had grown large enough to change that math. He had not forgotten that. He had not forgotten it. He had simply, and this was the word that arrived in the quiet of the apartment and landed with uncommon weight, insulated himself from it. Put enough glass between himself and that knowledge that it remained present but manageable, visible but not felt. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again. He called Marcus, his chief of staff, at 11 o'clock at night. "I need you to pull everything we have on the Cole Foundation's workforce reintegration programs," he said when Marcus answered, slightly groggy but trained not to let it show. "Specifically the ones focused on long-term unemployed adults. And I want a briefing on the city's housing waitlist, how it works, how long it actually takes, what the pressure points are." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Is this for the annual giving review?" he asked. "No," Harrison said. "It's for me." He ended the call and sat for another long time in the expensive chair, watching Chicago sparkle below him. Then he did something he had not done in years. He called his mother. It was nearly midnight. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake too. "I knew you'd call," she said. "You always say that," he told her. "I'm always right," she said. And then, more quietly, "How are you, baby?" And Harrison Cole, 42 years old, worth $4.3 billion, with the city at his feet and the future in his hands, took a breath and told her the truth. Kezia Washington found out about her mother on a Tuesday, which was not one of their Sunday call days, and the deviation alone was enough to tell her that something had shifted before she even answered the phone. She was in her studio apartment in Atlanta, a small, honest place she was proud of, with a bookshelf that covered one full wall and a window that let in good morning light and a kitchen just large enough to cook real food in, when her phone showed her mother's name. She was in the middle of making rice and had the wooden spoon in her hand and the radio on low, and when she saw the name she turned the radio off immediately, the way people do when they understand intuitively that they need their whole attention for what comes next. "Mama," she said. "Hey, baby," said Diane. Kezia put down the spoon. She leaned against the counter. She looked at the bookshelf without seeing it.
"Tell me," she said.
She did not ask if something was wrong. She already knew. The telling took a long time. Diane was methodical and honest, and spared neither herself nor the circumstance the clarity they deserved. She told Kezia about the last 14 months in the sequential, unflinching way of a woman who had made peace with the facts and was now, finally, ready for them to be shared. She did not cry. Kezia did, silently, with the phone pressed hard against her ear and her other hand flat against the kitchen counter, the tears coming not from shock alone but from the particular devastation of learning that your mother has been carrying something immense and alone while telling you she was fine. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kezia asked, when the telling was done. "I didn't want to pull you back," Diane said. "Mama." Kezia's voice broke around the word. "I would have come. I would have come immediately." "I know," Diane said. "That's why I didn't tell you." The logic of it, maternal and complete and thoroughly infuriating, landed on Kezia with its full weight. She understood it. She even, in a compartment of herself that was separate from her grief, respected it. But understanding something and accepting it were not the same thing, and she allowed herself to cry without managing it for a full minute before she put the grief in its place and began to think practically, the way her mother had raised her to. "Where are you right now?" she asked. "Still in Chicago," Diane said. "But something happened today." And she told Kezia about the bench, about Margaret, about Harrison Cole, and the coffee and the croissant, and the way the conversation had moved into places she hadn't expected. "He sent supplies through his driver before dark," she said. "Good ones. And I got a call this morning from someone named Marcus, who works for him, asking if I'd be willing to meet with Mr. Cole tomorrow." "To meet with him, why?"
Kezia asked.
"He didn't say exactly," Diane said. "Just that Mr. Cole wanted to follow up on the conversation." She paused. His voice was careful. The kind of careful that means something real is behind it. Kezia pressed her back against the kitchen counter and looked at the ceiling. In her second year of social work training, she had learned a great deal about the architecture of help, the kinds that transformed and the kinds that relieved symptoms while leaving structures intact, the kinds offered with genuine accountability, and the kinds offered with the subtle expectation of gratitude that could not be questioned. She had learned to be careful. She had learned to ask hard questions. She had learned that a billionaire offering to follow up on a conversation could mean many things, some of them genuinely good, and some of them performances of goodness that were, ultimately, about the person performing. "Do you trust him?" she asked her mother. There was a pause on the line that said Diane had been asking herself the same question. "I trust that he surprised himself today," Diane said finally. "I'm not sure what that means yet for tomorrow. But it means something."
Kezia thought about this.
She thought about her mother's judgment, which had been earned through 19 years of reading frightened people in the dark and understanding them accurately. She thought about the leaf on the canvas bag. She thought about what it meant that her mother was calling her, now, finally, after 14 months of careful protection, and what that choice meant about where Diane had arrived inside herself. "I'm coming," Kezia said. "Kezia. I'm coming this week.
Don't argue.
I have flex days and I've been saving them." She pushed herself off the counter and picked up the wooden spoon and turned the heat back on under the rice with the steady efficiency of a person who has made up her mind. "I should have been there. I know you were protecting me. I love you for it. But I should have been there, and I'm coming now."
There was silence on the line.
Then Diane said, very quietly, "Okay." It was the most concession Kezia had heard her mother make in years, and it told her everything about how tired and how ready and how genuinely human her mother was at that moment, past the dignity, past the protection, past the carefully held composure. Just a woman, loved, allowing herself to be known. "Okay," Kezia said back. She called in her flex days that night. She booked a train ticket for Thursday. She did not sleep well, but she slept with the particular purpose of a person who knows exactly what they're going to do when they wake up. On her bookshelf, on the third shelf from the top, in a clear plastic sleeve, was a single pressed autumn leaf, yellow, shot through with orange, from a scrapbook she had kept since she was 7 years old. Harrison Cole's offices occupied the top 4 floors of a building on South Wacker Drive that he had purchased outright in 2018, renovated with the input of 3 architectural firms, and filled with the particular aesthetic of successful ambition: clean lines, warm wood, the kind of art on the walls that cost enough to impress without being obvious about it. The lobby alone was the size of a small airport terminal, with 30-foot ceilings and a waterfall feature that ran silently down one entire glass wall and had cost, if Harrison recalled correctly, $280,000 to install. He had never, until that Thursday afternoon, thought of it as anything but practical good taste. Diane Washington arrived at 11 o'clock in a coat that was not hers. Margaret Cole had sent it over through Desmond that morning, along with a note that simply read, "It's cold and you deserve to be warm. Don't argue, it suits you. M." The coat was a good one, charcoal gray with a proper lining, and it did suit her, and Diane had stood outside the church where she had been spending nights in the adjacent warming room and looked at the note for a long moment before putting the coat on with the dignified practicality of a woman who knew the difference between charity and kindness. Marcus met her in the lobby and walked her up without the performance of preamble that he usually employed with visitors. No deliberate routing past the art collection or the river view, none of the choreography of impressing. Harrison had specifically asked him not to do any of that, which had surprised Marcus enough that he'd asked for clarification, which Harrison had not provided. The meeting took place not in Harrison's formal conference room, the glass-walled one that looked out over the river and was designed to communicate power through transparency, its $2,000 chairs arranged to signal who was central and who was peripheral, but in the smaller room at the corner of the executive floor, the one that had a table for 6 and a window that looked east and a coffee set up on the credenza that Marcus had stocked that morning with a particular care of. Someone who understood that the details of hospitality carried meaning. Harrison was already there when Diane was shown in. He stood when she entered, which was not his habit in professional meetings. He shook her hand and pulled out a chair that was across the table from his own, which placed them at equal distance from the center, which was not an accident. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for the invitation," she said. They sat. Coffee was poured. There was a brief, slightly awkward moment that Harrison chose not to rush. "I want to ask you something first," he said, "and I want you to understand that your answer will not affect anything I'm about to offer, and that I'm asking for my own understanding, not as a condition." Diane regarded him with the calm, measuring eyes that he was beginning to recognize as her default mode of receiving the world. "Go ahead," she said. "When my mother leaned on your shoulder," he said, "and you stayed still so she could sleep, you didn't know who she was. You didn't know who I was. There was nothing in it for you, in any transactional sense. Why did you do it?" Diane was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone formulating a strategic answer, but the quiet of someone going to the actual place where an answer lives. She was cold, she said. And she looked like someone who had been strong for a long time and needed a moment to not be. She met his eyes steadily. "That's enough of a reason." Harrison held her gaze. He nodded slowly. "That's enough of a reason," he agreed. He opened the folder that Marcus had prepared and placed in front of him, but he did not consult it. He had memorized what was in it. "I run a foundation alongside the company," he said. "It does some good work, but I've become aware, recently and specifically, that there are areas where it's efficient without being effective. Systems approaches without enough attention to the human in the system." He paused. "I want to restructure the workforce reintegration program. I want someone with clinical experience, lived experience, and the particular quality of attention that you demonstrated on Tuesday to help design how it actually works. Not as a charity case, as a consultant, paid at a rate commensurate with your experience and expertise. If that arrangement works, I'd like to discuss a permanent director role." Diane looked at him for a long, careful moment. "You don't know me," she said. "You spent 2 hours on a bench with me. I know that you kept a sleeping woman warm for 20 minutes without being asked," Harrison said. "I know that you told your story without self-pity and without performance. I know that you corrected my language when I got it wrong and accepted my apology when it was real." He folded his hands on the table. "I know you're a nurse who is still, fundamentally, a nurse. I'd like to verify the rest through a proper process, references, credentials, the works. But I know the part that matters and the rest is details." Diane looked out the window for a moment. The city was visible beyond it. The whole improbable, complicated, gorgeous, difficult city, with everything in it. "My daughter is arriving Thursday," she said. "I'd like her to be part of any further conversations. She's studying social work. She'll ask better questions than I will." Harrison did not hesitate. "I'd welcome that," he said. And somewhere across the city, in a house in the neighborhood she had grown up in, Margaret Cole set down her telephone with a satisfied smile and folded her hands in her lap and looked out her window at the October trees. It did not happen quickly, because real things rarely do. There were meetings and processes and the inevitable friction of bureaucracy, consultants' agreements negotiated through lawyers, credential verifications conducted through the proper channels, a formal interview process that Harrison insisted upon both for Diane's protection and his own accountability. Marcus, who had worked for Harrison for 9 years and considered himself a reliable reader of his employer, spent the first 2 weeks quietly convinced that some unforeseen complication would collapse the arrangement and return things to their former shape. He was wrong. Kezia arrived on Thursday as promised, on the 7:15 Amtrak from Atlanta, carrying a rolling bag and a tote and the particular focused energy of a woman who has identified a problem and organized herself to meet it. She was 23 and sharp-featured and had her mother's calm eyes and an additional quality, a directness inherited from some other branch of the family tree that announced itself in the first 30 seconds of any meeting. She met Harrison on Friday morning in the small corner conference room, with Diane beside her, and spent the first 20 minutes asking questions that were, as Diane had predicted, significantly harder than anything Diane had asked. She asked about the Foundation's current outcomes data and what metrics it used to evaluate success. She asked whether the workforce reintegration program had been designed with input from program participants or primarily by people who had studied poverty without having lived it. She asked what accountability structures existed to ensure that the director role, if created, would have genuine authority rather than symbolic inclusion. She asked these questions without aggression but also without apology, in the flat, clear voice of someone who had learned to ask them because she had seen what happened when they weren't asked. Harrison answered each one, not with the practiced fluency of a man managing an impression, but with the honest assessment of a man who had spent the past week reading his own Foundation's reports with genuinely new eyes and finding, repeatedly, that the gap between the organization's stated values and its operational reality was larger than he had been comfortable admitting. The current program has a 68% short-term employment placement rate, he said, which is good. The 12-month retention rate is 31%, which is not. Kezia looked at him. Do you know why? She asked. I'm starting to understand why, he said. I'd like your help understanding better. Kezia looked at her mother. Diane looked back at her daughter with the particular expression of a parent watching a child demonstrate everything they hoped for them and feeling the full, complicated weight of that. We need somewhere to stay while this is worked out, Kezia said to Harrison, returning to the practical without sentimentality. My mother is not going back to a bench while we are in the middle of negotiations, and I have a train ticket that goes back to Atlanta in 5 days. I'm not going to pretend the housing situation isn't part of this. It's already arranged, Harrison said. Through the Foundation's Transitional Housing Partnership, not my personal property, because I thought that would be inappropriately paternalistic and create an unhealthy dynamic. There's a furnished unit available in Hyde Park, 6-month lease covered, with the option to extend at subsidized rate pending the employment arrangement.
He paused.
I asked my mother what she thought about this approach. She told me it was the right call, which I found reassuring. Kezia looked at him with an expression that held a number of things simultaneously: the wariness that her training had taught her, the assessment she was running, and underneath both of these, fighting for space, something that was not quite trust, but was its immediate predecessor. Okay, she said. Okay, Harrison said. The arrangement was formalized over the following 3 weeks. Diane moved into the Hyde Park apartment with Kezia, who delayed her return to Atlanta by extending her flex leave and then, with her program supervisor's blessing, arranged to complete her final field placement semester with a Chicago social services organization that had been on her list of options. She did not want to miss what was beginning. And what was beginning was genuinely something. Diane met twice a week with the Foundation's program staff and began the methodical, respectful, occasionally uncomfortable work of examining what the workforce program did and why, and what it needed to do differently, and how. She brought to these meetings the same quality of attention she had brought to frightened patients in the middle of the night, fully present, unafraid of difficulty, capable of sitting in the complicated truth of a situation without rushing toward the comfort of a premature resolution. Harrison attended many of these meetings. He did not chair them. He listened, which was, Diane told Kezia one evening over the dinner they had taken to cooking together most nights, the thing she had not expected from him, not the offers, not the resources, but the actual sustained willingness to listen to things that reflected poorly on decisions he had made. He doesn't like being wrong, Kezia said, which was an observation rather than a criticism. No, Diane agreed. But he's more afraid of staying wrong than of admitting it. That's rarer than it sounds. Margaret Cole came to the Hyde Park apartment for dinner on a Sunday in November, brought by Desmond and carrying a covered dish of the sweet potato pie that Harrison had once told a magazine interviewer he had not eaten in decades. She sat at the small table with Diane and Kezia and ate and talked and told stories about Harrison as a child, the serious, watchful, quietly tender boy he had been before the world had taught him that tenderness was a liability, with the loving, slightly merciless accuracy of a mother who adored her son and intended him to become, again, someone worthy of it. In the second week of December, on a Friday afternoon when the first real snow of the season was coming down over Chicago in the thick, purposeful way that Chicago snow comes, committed, without apology, Harrison Cole left the office at 3 o'clock. This was not normal. This was, in the 9 years of his chief of staff's employment, unprecedented on a non-emergency, non-travel Friday. Marcus stood at the elevator and watched him go with the expression of a man who has been witnessing a gradual metamorphosis and is only now beginning to accept that it is real. Harrison walked. He did not take the car. He was not going anywhere specific at first, just walking in the snow, which is a thing that people do in Chicago when they need to think and have remembered that thinking and walking have a very old agreement between them. His coat was good. He had always owned good coats. The snow came down on his shoulders and on the sidewalks and on the bare arms of the elm trees and on the benches and on the city equally, the great indifferent democracy of weather. He walked south. He was not consciously going toward the bench on Garfield Boulevard. But he arrived there anyway because some things have gravity. The bench was empty in the snow. Of course it was. Diane was in Hyde Park in the warm apartment, probably cooking something with Kezia, probably reading one of the program reports with her steady, unsentimental eye. The bench was just a bench. Wood and iron, snow-covered, occupying its ordinary corner of the ordinary street that Harrison had driven through without seeing for the better part of a decade. He stood in front of it for a while with the snow coming down. He thought about his father, Robert Cole, who had worked his whole life and died at 58 without seeing his son become what he became, who had coached Harrison's Little League team with the same serious, tender attention he brought to everything, who had told Harrison once when Harrison was about 11 years old and had been cutting in front of another kid at the water fountain. Every person you see is someone's whole world. Don't act like they're furniture. Robert had said it quietly, without theater, and Harrison had heard it and known it was true and spent 30 years learning how to unknow it, because unknowing it was more economically convenient. He was done unknowing it. He sat down on the bench in the snow in his good coat and took his phone out of his pocket and called Marcus. "I want to restructure the giving program," he said. "Not just the workforce piece. All of it. I want to convene a review that includes current and former program participants as equal voices, not consultants, not focus groups, equal voices in actual governance." He paused, watching the snow accumulate on his shoes. "And I want to expand the transitional housing initiative. Get the legal team to look at what we'd need to create a permanent fund, not year-to-year grants, a permanent endowment, something that doesn't depend on anyone's goodwill having a good year." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "This is going to require a significant board conversation," he said carefully. "I know," Harrison said. "Schedule it." He hung up and put his phone back in his pocket and sat in the snow for a while longer. He called his sister Renata in Detroit, who he had not called simply to talk in longer than he could precisely remember. She answered with surprise in her voice that moved quickly into warmth, the particular warmth of someone who had been missing you without saying so, because saying so felt like too much pressure to put on the missing. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her kids, his week, the snow, their mother, a television show Renata was watching that Harrison had heard of but not seen, the restaurant where they had gone as children for birthday dinners, and whether it was still there. It was not. But a new place had the same owner's granddaughter's name above the door, which felt like something. When he hung up, he was cold in a way that was also, somehow, comfortable. He reached into his coat pocket. He had put it there that morning without fully accounting for why, and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it, in Margaret's neat, library-shaped handwriting, was the address of the Chicago Food Pantry Network that she had been quietly volunteering at on Thursday mornings for the past 2 years. Beneath the address she had written, in the same neat hand, "They could use the help. Both kinds." Harrison looked at the paper for a long time. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. The snow was coming down with its old, patient commitment. The street was quiet. The elm trees held what snow they could and released the rest. And in an apartment in Hyde Park, Kezia Washington opened a box she had shipped from Atlanta, A box of things she had brought from her bookshelf, from her kitchen, from the small, honest materials of her built life, and found, wrapped in a sweater near the top, the clear plastic sleeve with the scrapbook page inside. The leaf was still there. Yellow, shot through with orange, pressed flat by the years, preserved exactly. She held it for a moment, and then she carried it to the kitchen where her mother was making tea, and she set it on the table between them, and Diane looked at it and then looked at her daughter, and neither of them said anything for a while because some things don't need to be said to be understood. Outside, Chicago was filling up with snow. Inside, the kettle sang. And somewhere in the middle of the city, on a bench on Garfield Boulevard, a man who had once forgotten where he came from was remembering.